I'm delighted to announce Enter the Boardroom now has its first sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform saving you time and money on your cross-border transactions. As an investor, I was acutely aware of the value of hedging FX exposure. I used to live in fear of funding shortfalls at a closing or making a loss in a business having forecast a profit. However, as a CEO, I'm embarrassed to say I have dropped the ball on FX. Because we invoice our revenue in pound sterling, I stupidly thought we had minimal FX exposure. After speaking with Alt21, I realized a significant proportion of our software costs are in US dollars. So we have wasted money on FX fees and wide spreads, while also taking on unnecessary risk in our budgeting because we assumed the spot rate would continue through the year. I can't be the only one to have slipped up on this, and it's an area board members can quickly add value with the right questions. Alt21 allows you to lock in fixed fees and secure exchange rates before any cross-border transaction, allowing you to budget with certainty and protect your business from market volatility. At NewRoll, we're now forecasting savings of 90% on the fees we incur on the tens of thousands of monthly FX spend thanks to Alt21. Head to alt21.com, that's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with NewRoll, a business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of NewRoll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Joy Harcup and Dame Una O'Brien. Joy is an executive coach and board reviewer with over 20 years' experience working with clients in the FTSE 100, public and not-for-profit sectors. Holding an MBA from Bath University, researching the impact of coaching, she is a former president of the UK board of the International Coaching Federation, the largest professional body of coaches. She has sat on boards in the education and arts sectors. Joy is the co-author of The Art and Psychology of Board Relationships. Dame Una is currently on the boards of the Lloyd's Register Foundation and Ashmolean Museum at the University of Oxford, and a senior visiting fellow at the Institute for Government. Formerly, she's been on the boards of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Macmillan Cancer, University of Birmingham, UK Ministry of Defence, Government Legal Service Board, and Charity for Civil Servants, where she was chair. Her executive background was in public service, most recently running the UK Department of Health as the Permanent Secretary from 2010 to 2016. Joy and Dame Una, a huge welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, great to be here, Ollie.
This is our first ever Enter the Boardroom episode with two guests, which is going to be an interesting experiment, and I'm excited to see how this goes. For those who haven't read the book, you identified 7 archetypes of difficult boardroom dynamics that happen at main, subsidiary and committee level boards. Could you just give a brief overview of what those 7 archetypes are for those listening?
We identified these from our Helen and I's experience, and we wanted to stress test them on our interviewees. So we interviewed 40 people who were chairs, CEOs, but from all sorts of different sectors, from SMEs up to PLCs, and often had a portfolio of different types of board roles. Luckily, they all agreed that these were ones they'd seen too, and gave us some very rich stories. The 7 was, you could bunch them into the first 3, which are where you've got very high emotions on the board. It's very clear there are tensions. It's very obvious that there's emotionally charged atmosphere. So we talked about the first one called executive, non-executive seesaw, where you've got the executive and non-executive holding power, trying to hold power together, trying to balance power together. And you've got the executives sometimes feeling, as Una mentioned, the non-executives are interfering and going into their operational space. And then you've got the non-executives who are thinking, but we're not given enough detail. How do we know that this is truly, what is the situation on the ground when you're presenting this beautifully crafted proposal? So that was the first one. The second one was where there's actually a standoff. We called it the negotiating a standoff, where there is very much polarized positions, people entrenched. Somebody wants, one section of the board wants to go for growth, the other wants to stay niche, that sort of scenario. And you've got really absolute thinking and people are at loggerheads. And that actually was the one that most people had information about and stories about. So that was the top one for data. And maybe that's because it was the most visceral and the most obvious for people to see. But a close second was the executive, non-executive seesaw. And then the other highly charged one was the one that's banishing bully on boards, which I know you said, Oliver, that your community often talk about is something a bullying scenario. And it's very nuanced. It's difficult to call out sometimes because it can be microaggressions or it can be a full very aggressive behavior. There's a big spectrum. And we were particularly interested in it from a bystander point of view. Why does people on boards often sit back and don't do anything, even though they can see this dynamic happening? And we were also interested in what you can do to change that. The next two are more, if you went into the boardroom, it would seem calm, it would seem organised and low on emotion. But actually, it's where there's more complacency and compliance, which is, as we've seen from recent board crises, a very risky place to be because you're not seeing the future and you're not involved sometimes in the decision making. So the compliant one was we called it the passive rubber stamp board. And how do you change that into a more assertive board? So where the power is held perhaps by some strong individuals and the rest of the board are not involved, or the power is outside the board. If you've got a global board or a parent company that's really taking decisions, or a founder who's no longer on the board but is a shadow in the background who people are really deferring to. So that's the rubber stamp board. And then the ivory tower board is more the complacent board. Oh, we don't need to worry. Things have always gone well in the past. We've got this fantastic magician of a CEO. He's always been successful. And in that scenario, people aren't looking down to see what's really going on the ground with the product or the service that they're providing, or they're not looking outwards as to what might be the risks around the corner, be they warfare, the geopolitical risks in the world they operate. So that's more the complacent smug board, really. And then the last two, these are where threats are there from the outside and how you react to those. So we looked at diversity and how you could harness diversity better. And the data there was that people really wanted to have a diverse board, be it in the sense of neurodiversity or other types of diversity. But it was a slow process in getting there. And once they were there, they actually found it hard to make most of the diverse minority that were on the board. And that minority often felt they weren't properly recognised. They were only asked questions about their as a woman or as an ethnic group and weren't appreciated for their whole talents. And also the majority were awkward. They didn't want to offend, so they actually were holding back, and maybe that was something that was going on too. So that was the diversity aspect. Then the last one, which everybody had a very vibrant story to tell, which was the doomsday scenario, where they faced an existential crisis, hopefully not on more than one board at once that they were sitting on. And it might be usually a financial one, but nowadays just as much a reputational crisis. So we called it Facing the Doomsday Scenario, and how people behave very differently in those scenarios. Helen, my co-author, has a colleague who says that people are like tea bags. You never actually know how they're going to behave until they're in hot water. And that was certainly the case with some of the stories that we were told. So I hope that gives you a flavour, Ollie.
Brilliant. So we got the high emotion boards, the low emotion boards, the dysfunctional diversity, and then those facing some sort of doomsday scenario. Una, does that resonate with your experience as a board member? Do any one of those scenarios really jump out at you?
Yeah, and they certainly struck me, particularly doomsday, and maybe we'll come on to that, but also going back to my early experience working with non-executives when I was the permanent secretary at the Department of Health, the one that really hit me between the eyes was seesaw. And it may be worth just saying a little bit about the experience of that, because I've both been if you like, the chief executive interacting with the non-execs. And nowadays I find myself the other side of things, a non-exec interacting with chief executives. And actually, reading this chapter in Joy's book has really helped me to get broader perspective around that relationship. When I became permanent secretary in 2010, that was a point at which government departments were being given very highly capable amazing new non-executives, pretty much all drawn from the private sector. And in the Department of Health, we had 5 new non-executives. I was new in my job effectively as the chief executive, and it was quite a tussle. In that first 12 to 18 months, there was tension on that board. And just to sort of reference my recollection about how it affected me physically, the build up to those meetings, I would find that feeling a lot of tension in my body. If I was challenged in the meeting, could almost feel like a punch. And that physical experience, I now see, and reading more of the background that Joy has given us, led me to perhaps be more defensive than I really wanted to be, more protective of the approach my team was taking, rather than a more sort of equal, open dialogue across the table. So obviously, over time, we did work this out. We were all new, and in the end, there was no short circuit to spending time together, the top executive team with the non-executives. And I think the key thing we did was to be clear about our roles and the levels of work that were being brought to the board, and to be more explicit about the areas where the board was going to provide a challenge. Obviously, not being a commercial board or a statutory board, there was much more of a sort of organic space to be clarified. But I think the real, just coming back to the insights that Joy has helped me over, is that now when I am a non-executive interacting with chief executives on the board, I'm just so much more mindful of the impact of my intervention and how I speak, how I might speak to the chair beforehand if I've got a big issue with something the chief executive is bringing, but also to be confident about talking offline with the chief executive if I do feel I need to raise something in the group as a whole, and knowing that can have a physical and a sort of defensive effect on a chief executive. Yeah, it's given me a richer terrain for my contributions.
Resonates a lot with me, and I think that definitely was one of my learnings as a non-exec, that journey from when you first start and you're desperate to show that you can add value as a non-exec, to realizing actually, you know, that's going to be a disaster. The CEO is going to resent that if you start pointing out things they haven't seen, and actually your role is to make them really shine and for you to melt into the background almost. Joy, really interested to hear your analysis, having heard Una talk through her experience of that executive, non-executive seesaw. Is that very common embodiment of that archetype?
Yeah, yes, it is. It is, absolutely. If you look at psychodynamics, which looks at defense mechanisms, which Una mentioned, often what's going on here is that talks about your subconscious and your early experience impacting your board behavior. And so Una's feelings of defensiveness, of under threat, would be going on underneath unconsciously. And we produce these defense mechanisms in order to dull the anxiety and dull the pain that we're feeling. Some psychologists call it our psychological painkillers, and it makes it easier to live with ourselves. I know when Una and I have spoken about this before, she's mentioned the fact that she felt in her new role, the non-execs were not taking her seriously. They hadn't actually taken into account her previous experience, etc.
Yeah, I think, Joy, there was a sense of, can't they see how hard I'm working? Surely they shouldn't be questioning me like this. It's an interesting dynamic, the point at which a chief executive is at in their journey. Because if somebody's new into the role for the first time or new into the organization, that's potentially a different dynamic from when you're joining a board and there's a seasoned chief executive in place. And just to be mindful of the impact of what you say and how you say it. I don't think board members should shy away at all from saying what needs to be said. But this insight really, I think, gives us a superpower in being able to communicate more effectively.
So just to make sure I got that, I think what you're saying is for a board member interacting with a CEO to be very conscious of where they are in their journey and to temper the way that you approach a particular issue, not to avoid the issue, but just to approach it in a different way depending on where they are in their journey, their confidence levels.
I would say being a just and reference and be respectful of it. But it doesn't mean to say you hold back on what has to be said in the boardroom. It's all about how can you be maximally effective. And a new chief executive is going to bring a different story, a different set of hopes and anxieties compared with someone who's very seasoned in the job. So yeah, I would invite people to be mindful of that in their interactions.
Joy, I can feel Marianne Seacart, who is a past episode guest, sitting on my shoulder after that interruption for the failing on the authority gap. Apologies.
Just going to add to that it may well be projection going on here, that Una was projecting her own insecurities and her fact that she felt insecure and undermined. That's what she felt within herself. And she was projecting that onto the Neds, thinking they were thinking that of her, because that's a way of repressing her own feelings of insecurity. So that may well have been what was going on. The other thing that we find in these circumstances is transference as well, that you might be transferring your feelings or thinking that you associate with a person in the past and you're attributing that to somebody in the present. When we've been talking at conferences about the book, a number of people have come up to us and said, yes, when I'm in the boardroom, the chair triggers my feelings of my father and I notice myself behaving as I did towards my father. Or another sibling, the sibling rivalry comes out. Yes, I feel like the little one in the family again. And that's quite a common thing to happen. I'm actually very close to my sister, and I've noticed that I replicate my close relationship with my sister in the workplace. I went on a psychodynamic course, and my big takeaway from that was actually I'm pairing up with other people in my work life, just like I paired up closely with my sister. And it was quite a revelation. Just to notice that and know it is really helpful. Just think, is there another strategy I should adopt here?
Now, there are three terms you've used there, which you go into in more detail in the book, projecting, transference and pairing, which I wasn't that familiar with. Can you just expand for those who aren't familiar with those concepts, what they are exactly?
So projecting is when we have feelings within ourselves that we find uncomfortable and it's difficult for us to live with them. So therefore we subconsciously, what we're doing in order to live with ourselves with those uncomfortable feelings is attributing them to somebody else. So we're saying, oh, the Neds are behaving like this, being unreasonable, because actually we feel we're being unreasonable ourselves. We're just putting that onto the Ned. And that's a way of suppressing our own anxiety and our own fears. So that's projection. They come from Freud and Freud's investigations and also were built on by his daughter, Anna Freud. So they've got long roots. And then the transference part is, again, it's another defense mechanism, another way of defending ourselves when we feel threatened or under pressure. But this time it's something from your past. It's a behavior and a relationship that you had in your past, usually with your family, because that's your first team or your first interaction with a group. And when you feel or subconsciously notice that happening to you in the boardroom, you then find yourself automatically replicating that behavior in the boardroom as well. And sometimes in groups, with group defenses, we have a psychologist called Bion looked into group defenses against pressure. And he discovered that actually being in a group in itself is really frustrating. So even though you're very task focused in the group, underneath you've got these ebbs and flows of psychological happenings, which again is defending yourself against pressure. And one of those is pairing. You actually pair with somebody else in order to save the group, which is why you might see, I don't know, the chair and perhaps another Ned pairing together to get rid of the chief exec. That might be an unconscious way of dealing with the fact that you don't think the group is behaving how you want the group to behave. It's seen as a creative way of overcoming an issue. Psychologists would say it was unconscious.
I can imagine some people listening to this might think, oh my gosh, this is psychobabble. Like suddenly the boardroom dynamic is all the fault of your mother and your father. And as someone who sits in the boardroom with my mother and my brother, feels very, very close to home. But Una, I'm really interested to hear, without wishing to put you in the chair, how does that resonate for you as an experienced board member?
Yeah, it's a group. And the interesting thing about a board is that power has to be shared. And so it's like any other group where power has to be shared. But the truth is there aren't that many other groups certainly I worked in a very hierarchical organization in the civil service. And it felt very different being in a board because we had literally all sitting around the table with different roles, but the hierarchy that I was used to wasn't necessarily helping me there. So I think it helps to remember that this is a group of human beings and that you don't stop human behavior at the door of a boardroom, and that good behavior and bad behavior is going to affect your ability to fulfill your purpose. So being mindful of that, it doesn't mean to say we have to become immobilized by it. Being mindful of it and having the knowledge that your impact can be destabilizing to the group as a whole I've found it more and more helpful to know about this stuff. But let me be honest, I'm not reading up on psychology before I go to a meeting. This is something that I absorb, I think about, and actually we haven't yet touched on the other aspect of, she does give a lot of practical tips on how to deploy this knowledge in real time. And that I find really handy as well. But this sense that you are in a high powered group of people who bring their human behaviors and their backgrounds into the room and do not leave them at the door, but that plays out, it is really useful to help that group achieve its purpose.
I guess if you are in a board with one of these dysfunctional dynamics at work and you can identify it, already being able to put a label on it is helpful because that's the beginning of being able to unpick it. But can you give an example perhaps where that has happened, where you've identified someone is projecting and the fact that they've identified them has then helped them unlock or help the board unlock that situation, Joy?
So I think we wrote this book not wanting to psychoanalyze people. We wanted to increase people's self-awareness so that then they could go and look at where they could get help. Is there a coach, a mentor, a board advisor or a psychologist who might be able to help them? That's the reason why we did it. And one of the stories in the book was that the CEO and the chair had really fallen out. The CEO was new, and Una talked about was feeling as if they were under pressure because they were projecting their own insecurities onto others, and they felt that the other Neds were being unreasonable. So what they actually did, chair actually talked to them had a feelings conversation with them. How are you feeling? And also shared how they had behaved when they were new in their executive role. And by doing that, they then were able to have a much more honest conversation about what was going on between them, and I think the CEO was given a coach and said what he wanted from the chair in their relationship. So they started to have a much more human to human conversation. And when we looked at the data in our book, we saw that actually the key to a lot of these issues and approaches was, we called it the art of board relationships, which was firstly raising everybody's self-awareness so that they could start to think, how am I behaving? How am I contributing to the situation? And also to identify the sort of dynamic that they might be in from the dysfunctions that we'd identified. They spot them because sometimes it's quite difficult to spot when you're in it. Then the R is relating better to each other. So having these detailed conversations, talking to each other outside the boardroom is really important so that you build up trust between everybody and you get to know how you bring the best out of everybody. And people don't feel these defense mechanisms so much because they feel secure and they feel understood. And it's just a way of survival, preserving yourself really is what these defense mechanisms are doing. And then a series of tactics. What can you do tactically in order to help? And so it's either tools and techniques from the psychology or management that might help. And in the scenario with the executive and non-executive, they weren't getting on. The chair actually suggested that even though he was new, that the CEO became a Ned on another board, because he could then understand by sitting in that position why the non-executives were behaving as they were and asking the questions they were asking. So being in their shoes and having more empathy was what was needed for him to really understand that and not be sceptical about or fearful of what the Ned was doing, and could understand that the Neds were trying to work in partnership.
Really interesting. That fits very nicely with one of the big penny drops for me over the last couple of years, which was an insight from a book called CEO Excellence, which looked at the common characteristics of the highest performing CEOs. And one of them was that they all have an independent board role. Just going back, we've talked about the executive, non-executive seesaw. And you said of those 7 archetypes, the one that everyone had experienced was the doomsday scenario. I'm curious, Una, to hear, did you experience a doomsday scenario that you could...
Yeah, you've got to prove it.
Probably my all 6 years being a permanent secretary. I don't know. No, I'm joking, obviously. I think that for me, I would see the doomsday scenario as when the very existence of the board is called into question. And so I've never myself been on a board where that has happened, but I may have caused it to happen on certain boards of arm's length bodies or regulators that we were reforming at that time. And it's a very normal thing in government for there to be changes in these organizations, but they all have boards. People who've put a huge amount of personal effort into making that organization effective then find that their existence is going to come to an end. And I've observed every behavior you could imagine in response to that. A real sort of pulling up the drawbridge, resisting the change, not cooperating with a successor organization or an organization that's going to be the result of a merger, right the way through to, we get it. What do you need us to do? When do you want us to step away? So different reactions, which probably are rooted in all sorts of background behaviors that are not really visible to me. One of the things that I was struck about reading Joy's chapter was really how boards can prepare for this sort of thing. How do they prepare for emergencies? They have very intentional and structured times when they step away from the day job and they run through different scenarios about how they're going to react, what their roles will be. And it always strikes me when I see some boards dealing with the shock scenario, how unprepared they are. And therefore, sort of that's where unplanned and random behaviors then take hold if there isn't a structure and a set of roles and procedures for people to follow when they're in a crisis situation. So yeah, I've found that incredibly helpful, how people fall into denial, protection of reputation, the blame game on the one hand, and yet others, for whatever reason, and hopefully Joy can enlighten us, step in and address the problem.
Before we ask Joy to do that, can you just bring one of those examples to life without breaking any confidences, with a bit more tangibility for someone who's struggling to grasp this? You're talking at sort of 10,000 feet there. Can you bring a really specific example to life?
Yeah, let's just take, there are plenty of them, 2 different types of example. One would be in 2020, there was a big crisis in the exams regulator Ofqual, when the whole algorithm for calculating A-levels and GCSEs was brought into question. And there was a real sort of crisis on that board because they had to determine, how do we respond to this? They had to deal with the immediate issue to do with all the young people and their results. They had to deal with a question about what on earth has gone wrong here. And then who is responsible and how is that going to work? Now, I wasn't on the inside of government at the time. I observed that from the outside. One of the interesting outcomes from that was a change in senior executives. Obviously, was a very intense and difficult discussion inside that board to try and work out how to deal with it. So that's an example of a doomsday scenario where the whole work of the organisation is thrown to one side. Another example would be going right the way back back sort of this time in the early 2000s when the Department of Health made the decision to abolish the quality regulator and replace it with another one. The decision for the existing regulator was extremely painful and they didn't agree with it. And so we got a lot of defensive behaviours and resistance to helping to build the bridge to the new organisation. It was very exhausting for everybody to work in an environment where people had a major disagreement, whether it was justified or not. And history will tell that all their behaviours made the doing of that so much more difficult. Now, that's a very different sort of scenario from what a commercial organisation might face, for example, with a criminal prosecution, the banking crisis. It's this sudden shock to a board where the whole purpose and enterprise is called into question and they're dealing with multiple levels of response simultaneously. Really tests the behaviour of those leaders right to the very brink of what they're capable of.
Joy, when you run that through the art algorithm, what does that look like to you?
Very familiar. Our interviewees talked of some people really stepping up. There was an example in a commercial board where they were about to go into administration, where people were acting really immorally, going in and taking company property and running away with them, because the brain and the body, if you look at it through neuroscience, is in survival mode. We each behave differently when we're in survival mode and under great threat. And it's partly due to our genes. So we have an automatic response sometimes to a big threatening shock, which might be to fight, flight, or flop and become ill. Or we also have our neural pathways because of our experiences of life, the way in which our nervous system is actually wired changes and is different depending on our life experiences and our business experiences. And if you found that actually I'm going to exit this board or I'm going to stay away and retreat has really helped you in the past, you find yourself repeating that in the present. Or if you're a fighter and thinking, I'm going to take charge, I'm really going to go for it, then you might find yourself doing that again. You're repeating that behavior. And if it's an ongoing situation where it lasts a long time, you will have a lot of stress going on in your body. There will be a lot of cortisol in your body, and that can impinge the way you think about things, but also will affect your mental or your physical health. And we had examples of people sharing how they had felt physically and mentally challenged as a result of long-term stress. So the awareness would be, ask yourself, how do I really behave under pressure? What do I normally do? Am I repeating that behavior? Who might I get to support me, my family, in managing this better? And really doubling down on self-care, which means looking at the things that will help you to survive that in a healthy way. And from the relating point of view, actually talking to others and relating to others and having dinners, even in a crisis, brings people closer together. It actually increases the neurochemicals that are de-stressors. And so actually having lighter moments, having meals, talking to each other. Our interviewees said that was really comforting and really helped. We all felt we were in it together, and there was a withdrawal symptoms when they were no longer in crisis, that there wasn't such strong bonding. And then again, as Una said, from the tactics point of view, having a plan again and having goals again helps clear the head. It helps engage the prefrontal cortex, that's the decision making, and helps to combat the stress hormones that are racing around your body. So yeah, having a clear strategic plan, executing that plan, ticking off the goals all helps. So there's a good neuroscientific reason why this works.
I love that neuroscience. I've always been very struck by the research that shows that when you're in that fight or flight mode, you've got the cortisol coursing through you, that your IQ drops, you're going to make less intelligent decisions. And it was very apparent to me actually in the recent podcast with Lord Mervyn Davis, when he is obviously very good at managing his stress. And he talked about some of the crises he's navigated after the Russian invasion, where they were at risk of having the entire organization sanctioned. And he talked about managing his body as a battery and knowing when he needed to recharge it. He's obviously very good and very conscious in the way that he does that.
Yes, I listened to that too, and I thought it was really good. It was really an example of you put yourself first, not to be selfish, but in order to actually make sure that you have enough energy to be on your peak form going through the crisis.
It's that loyalty to the team over loyalty to the individual, as the SEALs famously say. We've talked now about the executive, non-executive seesaw and the doomsday scenario. The other most common archetype, Joy, that you highlighted was the standoff situation. Can you just give us a overview of what that is in a bit more detail?
So it's when, as I said before, people are at loggerheads and they can't see a way forward. And the telltale signs in the book, we try and identify telltale signs that you can look out for and notice in any of these scenarios. And the telltale signs here were nobody's listening. You've all got your castles or fortresses of opinions, and nobody's actually, people lack curiosity and nobody's building on each other's ideas. There's some really extreme views, some absolute language. If you hear people saying, oh, he's so unreasonable or she's so uninterested, there's no nuance there at all, painting people in extreme ways. That was another example. Going back to Mervyn Davis's pet hate, I remember from listening to the podcast, he said it was where you had these back channels of people talking to each other. That was a very common complaint amongst chairs. In the past, people would be whispering in corridors, and now they're WhatsApping each other actually in the meeting. So they're not listening at all. They're certainly not building on ideas, and they're going into these little silos, and these silos are getting worse and worse. One chair called it irritatingly contagious as a behaviour, and most unprofessional. And then in the worst scenarios, it's goes down into the organisation. So you get silos of behaviours in different departments. So we had one example where it was actually different departments were competing in tendering to clients because they'd fallen out with each other. The client was absolutely shocked and obviously didn't want to do business with an organisation that wasn't joined up. But it came from the top. It came from the fact that the COO and the marketing director weren't getting on. So it can really filter down through the organisation. From the psychological point of view, again, going back to psychodynamic, it may well be that people are splitting things into good and bad because that's an easier way of dealing with things. Melanie Klein looked at the fact that from a very young, early age, we like to identify villains, and we play with toys which have villains and heroes, don't we? We watch films which have villains and heroes. So we are conditioned into trying to split things into good and bad. Again, we project this out of ourselves and say, that's bad, that's good. We see this in politics. Absolutist thinking is a really easy way of dealing with the world and defending yourself against pressure. So again, being really aware of that is really important in this standoff situation.
One thing I found very helpful in those situations is the question, who are we in service of?
Joy, Una, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round. I've never done one of these with two people, so it's going to be interesting to see how lightning we can be, but let's give it a go. If you're ready.
Yes.
First up, best book every board member should read.
Leadership Moments from NASA by David Williams and Elizabeth Howell. I am a spaceflight geek, and I think it is an extremely demanding and unforgiving environment and shows the incredible human capability to overcome challenges. And that is a really thought through book. I'd highly recommend it.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most.
When I sit in boards and I hear everybody say the same thing, but in their own particular language, and they haven't built on each other, I think, they're saying just what the other person said, but just in a slightly different way. So not having castles of opinion and needing it to be said in your own way, but thinking, how can I build on that?
Most valuable board ritual.
Joint visits to the front line. I've done a few of these. Recently, I went to the world's biggest shipyard in South Korea with board colleagues, and it was a fantastic opportunity to better understand each other and the things that we're responsible for.
Favourite quote?
I was going to choose What Got You Here Won't Get You There by Marshall Goldsmith, back to your point about keeping learning. But I was recently sent a book on women who lead, which is a book of photographs of leading women. And they have a quote each. And Jodie Whittaker, Doctor Who, her quote was, "Be yourself at your own pace." And I love that idea of at your own pace, because we're all individuals. It doesn't have to be a race for everybody. And we bring different things through our different paces.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
Very simply, go with the flow. I think that's terrible advice when you're on a board, because takes you into groupthink and rubber stamp. I try to put that to one side.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
It's that point we discussed right at the beginning that is absolutely essential to be on a NED on one board and a CEO or an executive on a board at the same time. I thought it was difficult when you were holding two big jobs, but now I think it's essential in order to have that experience and understand the other's perspective.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom? And what did you learn?
I think misreading the challenge of another colleague as being a judgment on me, as opposed to his genuine curiosity about the work we've been doing on one of the committees, confusing my needs with his curiosity. And I think I got that wrong.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I'm better at being bolder with my feedback, I think, and also saying the intention behind why I'm asking the question, because that's often what somebody needs to hear, the why, so that they don't then project these things or they're being interfering or they're criticizing me. So I would say that. And I think actually having trained as a coach helps with that, because you get used to become bolder with feedback and you become used to giving feedback as part of your practice.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
I would say it was, firstly, all that we've talked about from a psychological perspective is how we defend ourselves under pressure. And a lot of our behaviours are related to that. So to think about that and to be more informed about that would be helpful. Build self-awareness into your recruitment and into your own understanding of yourself, because if you are self-aware or start to become self-aware, it really helps you to be flexible and have other options in approaching things. And treat the relationship as another task that is really important to do to forge better board relations. Somebody we interviewed said he was a chair of FTSE 100 companies, PLCs, and he said, I realised that building the relationship was 80% of the task of what I should do. So yeah, keep that in mind and integrate that in everything you do on a board.
Joy, Una, it's been our first dynamic duo on the podcast, and I think it's been a success. Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom and experience.
Thanks for sharing yours as well. It's been great, really enjoyable.
Great conversation, Ollie. Thank you.
Building a non-exec career is hard. For those starting out, boards can be opaque. For more experienced board members, it can be lonely and hard to stay match fit. Having placed almost 4,000 people on boards in the last 5 years, we know what success looks like. It requires time, energy, resilience, information, and connections. New Role Plus, our community of board peers, exists to give you these things, offering you wholesale support as you try to get board roles and become a standout NED. Find out more at newrole.com/newrole-plus. That's newrole.com/newrole-plus.